Hi everybody, I'm Gillian Hepburn from Schroders and welcome to the 12th podcast from the Diversity Project Gender Workstream, the last and final one of this year, and haven't we had such good fun along the way. We brought this one forward due to Christmas. Normally, as you know, we do it in the last Friday of the month, but I'm sure we'll all be partying perhaps. This year we've explored a range of different themes and considered how, in particular, we can encourage women to join our industry. But as I say, every podcast, everybody's welcome, and all the themes that we've covered really have been relevant no matter what gender you are. All the previous podcasts are available on the website or on Spotify, YouTube and Apple Podcasts, so do feel free to listen to some of the previous ones. Last month we had a great time thinking about coaching and the benefits that it can bring. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, do take a listen. Do it over your Christmas break, but it was definitely one of my favourites for this year. It was really good fun. And as it's the last one for 2021, I've decided to take a slightly different direction this time. And I've got two incredibly interesting guests joining me today to talk about their career paths. So we're going to consider how career paths are not always linear, how choices and circumstances can affect this. And I'm going to ask them to share some of their wisdom and, of course, advice. So I'm really delighted to be joined today by Steve Butler, CEO at Punter Southall Aspire, and Lisa Young-Harry, CEO at HSBC Bank Pension Trusts UK Limited. As usual, I'm going to start by asking each of the guests to introduce themselves and give a little bit about their background. And this might take slightly longer than usual, because of the theme of the podcast today. So we'll ask them to give us a little bit of history about their career paths, and then we'll take that forward and explore a few specific themes that I'm sure will become apparent. So Lisa, welcome to the podcast, and let's start with you, and tell us a little bit about how you joined the industry and your career path up till now.
Hi Gillian, no, thank you for having me here today. Yes, it's an interesting one for me. I mean, I came into the UK. I'm originally from Nigeria. I came into the UK when I was 15, so didn't really know anyone. I remember I did my during my A levels. I remember my statistics teacher saying to me, we were talking about different careers. At that point, you had to decide, obviously, what you're going to study at university. And he suggested, he said to me, have you thought about the actuarial profession? Clearly, I had no clue about it. The little that I knew of it, I thought, oh, I like the sound of that. It seemed like it was quite an exclusive profession. And, you'd, on paper, it felt like you'd work in a city. I'd have my briefcase, I wear my power suit. And that was kind of the vision that I had. And I thought, well, it sounds okay. There's a bit of maths, and I kind of... had an affinity to maths, and I thought, yeah, okay, that sounds like an interesting profession. So I went to Southampton University and I studied maths with actuarial studies. So I did. It took me a while to find a job. Whilst everybody doing their final year, we're obviously getting jobs, applying and getting jobs. It definitely took me a while to get a job. I didn't find a job at that time when I graduated. But eventually I got a job, say about a year or so after graduation. But the job that I got was with an insurance company, and I think the title was an actuarial assistant, but it didn't come with, whilst it was doing, I'm not even going to call it typical actuarial work, it didn't come with the usual study package. You'd have a firm that would pay for your study materials, your exams and time off, and all of that's quite expensive. But I still wanted to, I knew that being an actuary was something that I wanted to do. So I kind of paid my own fees and took time off, holidays as study time off, etc. So I did all of that on my own. But within a year, I knew that I didn't want to really be in insurance. So I decided I wanted to go into pensions. Pension just it felt like it was more suited to me. And so I decided to go into pensions consultancy. And I was studying for the exam, and I had this little book. So I'm quite a bit of a planner. So I had a book of all the exams I was going to take, when I was going to take them, and in my own mind, when I was going to qualify. And in my book, there was no, oh, you might very well fail an exam or not. there was no room for failing, actually. So it was just a linear progression in terms of, once I start the exams and when I qualify. But I hit a roadblock. I failed the actuarial exams a few times, and I can't remember which subject it was, but it was just so difficult to kind of pass this subject. And then I move over to others, and I just wasn't passing any exams. So anyhow, that was quite a humbling experience for me, because I'd never failed an exam before. And my mind, academically, I was gifted. I graduated with first class in maths, and kind of never really, in my mind, as long as I put in the work, there's no absolute reason why I shouldn't pass. So that was tough. Anyway, I took a break and did an MBA, and that gave me time to kind of reflect and also kind of rest. And interestingly, whilst doing that MBA, I kind of it reaffirmed in my mind that I did want to continue with the actuarial profession, and I wanted to qualify as an actuary. So I worked with, completed my MBA, decided to go back to actuarial work with a few actuarial consultancy firms, with the last one being Hymans Robertson, and I was there for about 9 years. Whilst I was on adoption leave, when I was at Hymans, I've had a few adoption leaves actually, but I think it was my second one. That allowed me to kind of take time out to think about whether I was on the right path in terms of my career. And in my mind, you work for a consultancy, you be partner, etc., etc. But then I thought, actually, is this really what I wanted to do? And then I took time out to think about the skills that I had and where I thought that I'd be happier and would be best suited to me. And I felt like in-house governance and secretarial, all that sort of work was actually more suited to me and something that I'd be much happier doing. So when I went back to Hymans, actually after my adoption leave, I started to position myself and take on projects that I thought would give me the skills that I needed to actually accomplish what I wanted to do. So then I moved on. I left Hymans. I worked then at Prudential as head of pensions, Tesco, and now HSBC.
Thanks, Lisa. That's really fascinating. And I think there's a load of topics that we're going to explore later. But for me, things like planning. I love the story about your little book and the plans and the linear progression, and also failing. So we'll talk a bit about that, and also taking time out. And also you talked a bit about skills there. So we'll unpack all of that in a minute or two. But I'm going to hand over to Steve now. Steve, welcome to the podcast today. What's your story? You had a slightly different start, didn't you? So do you want to give us your story?
Yeah, hi. So I grew up in Hampshire in the New Forest. I went to a state school. I wasn't a very good student. I was easily distracted, always looking to do other things. I was rock climbing, mountaineering, anything but the books. So when I got to 18, all my friends got their A-levels and went to university, and I didn't do so well in my A-levels. So that was the first jolt in my life, that I wasn't following a path that everyone else was following. My dad said to me, right, time is to go out and get a job. So I got a job as an office junior in a regional life office, in the branch office of the life office. And I think that was when a switch went on, and I kind of realized that I couldn't mess around forever, and that I needed to kind of switch the ambition on. And my career progressed relatively quickly. And maybe I'm ashamed to say this, but I was very driven by the company cars at the time. You know, as an office junior, if I made it to be the salesperson, then I got a car. And if I got to be a senior salesperson, I got a better car. Which led me actually into the international division of the life company, because they had the best company cars. So I moved from that company, where I had progressed, to Royal Life, out of their Isle of Man office, and my sales area was Latin America. So I had a nice car, and I traveled to Latin America and carried on my kind of sales career. I was then recruited into Scottish Widows. They kind of made me head of sales and marketing for their international business. Had an even nicer company car. My personal area was Africa, and it was great. So by the time I got to my late 20s, my career had progressed in a very linear way in the sales and marketing area, and I'd had lots of fun along the way. found myself in a situation at that point that my career was stalling. I was working for a Scottish Life office, and all my bosses were actuaries, and there was my own kind of glass ceiling that I'd reached there. So under advice, I went and did an MBA, and a couple of things happened there. During that period in my life, my wife and I had 4 children by the time I'd finished my MBA. And I found myself at the end of the study realizing that actually business was quite easy and I didn't need to work for a big blue chip company. I also found a situation where I wanted to spend more time with the children, and the company was saying, no, you need to travel into the London office, you need to travel kind of globally. And I came home from work one day and said to my wife, I've just resigned. I don't want to do this anymore. So she was horrified. On the Monday morning, I set myself up as a consultant, as a sales and marketing consultant, and started to build a self-employed career. It was quite challenging because I'd been, a senior role in a blue chip company, and then I was just in his back bedroom kind of with his own business, but it wasn't really a business. So over the coming years, established an investment research business, which grew. I then got an investor, and it grew even more. And I found myself in the Punter Southall Group as kind of one of their subsidiary companies that they'd invested in. Punter Southall Group is quite an incredible group, very entrepreneurial. So they supported me to develop other businesses within the group, and I moved in. I ran their governance business for their investment consulting team. I ran their investment consulting business, and then 5 years ago, they wanted to grow a broad financial services business with employee benefit consulting and financial planning. So we agreed that I would lead a business called Punter Southall Aspire, and through a sort of buy and build strategy, go and kind of build another business for them, which is kind of where I am now.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really interesting. I feel like I've had a bit of a combination of the two of you, in fact, in terms of my career path. So I Steve, like you, I was at the local school, and I went into a life company, and I kind of stayed very steady there for about 22 years. And then I guess it went a bit chaotic because the plan didn't work out, and I ended up consulting as well. And if somebody said to me in those early days when I joined at 22 or whatever I was from university, this is where you'll end up, I wouldn't really have believed it. So some real similarities there, particularly around the actuarial piece. I think things have changed now, specifically in marketing, but I also get the bit about the company car. I moved into distribution too. It was great fun, although it wasn't quite as glamorous in terms of the countries that I was able to cover. But anyway, Lisa, let's go back. I just want to pick up on my first point in terms of you talked about how initially you found it difficult to get a job. What were some of the challenges there?
For me, my biggest challenge was not understanding what I was doing wrong, because on paper, I had certainly all of the academic qualifications, and it was really hard, even at interviews or when you'd go for those presentations. I just couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. And I think companies are a whole lot better now at giving you feedback. I didn't get any feedback. So in terms of, okay, what is it I'm doing wrong? Just, there was nothing. So that was quite hard. And I know things are different, and that's absolutely fantastic now that companies are making a lot of effort to provide feedback to those that don't quite make the rounds. And then also, it's just not having any guidance. I didn't have any kind of support network in terms of professionals that I could go into, maybe have practice sessions, interview sessions, etc. Mm-hmm. And things are a whole lot more better now, I think, in terms of the support that a lot of industries do support those that just graduated. So at that time, I think it was just not knowing where to go for help and how to get the help that I needed. But I'm just so pleased. I know there's so much help and so much support out there now for students.
Yeah, I mean, some really good points. And obviously at the end of this podcast, we always talk about kind of key learns and things and advice, but I think there's some there in terms of you can ask for feedback and almost don't be afraid to ask for feedback, and making sure you've got good support in place. And on a previous podcast, we also talked about the skills workshop, which is really helping people get into the industry and almost overcome some of those challenges that you faced there, Lisa. And Steve, what about you? You had a completely different start, didn't you, straight from school, but probably a bit more linear in those early days. So how did that kind of feel? And also, do you want to talk a little bit about your MBA and the importance maybe of qualifications?
Yeah, I mean, I was a very happy-go-lucky kind of guy, and when I didn't get the A-level results I needed, that was a real jolt. And I was really kind of quite fed up because all my friends were off to university and having this wonderful time, and I was still at home living with my parents. So that was, I don't know, quite a difficult time. I got my first job. I was an office junior, so I just did anything. I even remember going out into the park one Christmas to go and get the dirt to plant the Christmas tree, and I was doing those types of jobs. But I was quite happy to do it. It was kind of a fun place to start. But what I found through that 3-year period when everyone else was at university, I was able to progress my career quite quickly, and they came to university, 3 years later, got their first job. And it almost felt like I was 3 or 4 years ahead of them because I'd had this head start, and very little competition for me to progress my career at that age because none of the graduates had started. So I was able to really get my feet under the table and progress quite quickly. And I think I look back at that now, and it was a good 10 years before some of those friends of mine kind of caught with me career-wise because I didn't do a degree. So that was a positive thing, but I think what it left me was a bit of a chip on my shoulder about not having done a degree. I knew I was capable of it, but I hadn't done it. I did some insurance exams along the way, which helped me progress. But when I realised that my career had reached a limiting point because of my academic background, that again was the other jolt I needed to go back and study. And it was, I did it while I was working. I did it while we were having children. So it wasn't the easiest way to go about getting a degree. But it opened my eyes up to what was available, from a business perspective. With an MBA, you study all areas of business, not just one niche area. So it kind of really opens your mind up to what you can do next.
Yeah, it's really interesting you talking about joining straight from school. And we did an earlier podcast sort of busting that myth that you have to have a degree and it has to be from a certain university. I made a great girl on that talked about joining straight from school and how that felt. So it's really interesting because one of the things I'm always keen to try and get across is that you can join our industry from lots of different routes. And certainly I think we're much broader in terms of how we recruit people now. But speaking of the jolt, which I think it sounds like you had a couple of times in your career, which again is an interesting one. Lisa, it's maybe similar to you, that kind of no fail options, but then finding you were failing, if I could put it like that, was really a bit of a jolt. How did that really impact your confidence?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I was just generally a confident person in the sense that I had a plan. And my plan had no fail options. So clearly I was quite confident in my ability. So it didn't even occur to me that I should have, in case you fail, maybe register, maybe this is option B or something. So that certainly was not in my plan. So it did knock my confidence quite a bit. And I started to second guess myself, I started to wonder whether I was in the right place and I was doing the right thing, etc. Especially when I just kept trying, and each time I tried, the results would come out and I'd fail. I would say also, clearly with experience, you kind of learn resilience as well. You go through this thing, but also what really helps is when other people that have gone through something similar. I think that really helps because it makes you feel actually, this is someone that's done it and actually has reached the other side and has been successful and has completed exams. So you're not the only one that's kind of gone through this failing bit. And then I think having a good support network is actually quite key, so that when you are feeling like, you're not quite capable, there are people that are propping you up, etc. and help to build your confidence. I think that is quite key. But for me also, there's a resilience, but also getting perspective, and not, it's not the be all and end all. I think is sometimes when you lose perspective, you kind of lose yourself as well. And I think those are things that are quite important in terms of, yes, there's a plan and the plan's not quite working out, but not giving up, taking a step back to think about, is this the right path? And if it's not, then move on to something else. If it is, stick to it, etc. So those are sorts of things I think I would say.
Yeah, so it's almost like it's okay to have a plan, but actually what you need to be prepared for is for that plan to change, and how you adapt to it. And sometimes the change isn't necessarily within your own control in a way. And maybe, Steve, this relates to, I'm really keen to explore this work-life balance with you, because I'm guessing, well, Lisa talked about losing perspective here, and maybe that was, I don't know what prompted the whole work-life balance. And it's unusual, isn't it, for a man typically in our industry to try and move to more flexible working. Could you just talk a little bit about what happened there?
Well, I think my plan was always to keep moving forward and the kind of and the better job. And that led me to kind of traveling all over the world and kind of flitting between Edinburgh and Jersey and Africa. And in fact, when my second child was born, the company wanted me to travel up to 3 months. 3 weeks before they were born, I was still traveling, and 3 weeks after they were born, I was back traveling again. So I very quickly realized that I was missing out on quite a lot.
Yeah.
It wasn't just travel, it was kind of time in the office and this type of stuff. And I wrestled with it for a long time as to what is important to me, time with the children or my career. And obviously realized that the children grow up pretty quickly, and the career can be reignited at a different point. So I had this revelation moment where I just handed my notice in and went, no, I want to walk my children to preschool. I want to be there at those moments and not be the one that's kind of chasing their tail to just miss those moments.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud that, that 5-year period when they were young, I was there, and I have been able to rebuild my career since that point, and almost more successfully, because it took me in a different direction.
Yeah, and maybe that time out and a bit more reflection helped, did it in some way?
For sure. I think, but then if you're a busy person, you replace being busy with work with being busy.
Yeah, with something else. Yeah. And do you think, Steve, that the industry's moved on now in this regard in terms of greater flexibility and offering that to people?
It's patchy. I think, across the industry there are employers that are genuinely flexible, and those that kind of say that they are, but they're kind of not.
Yeah.
I think it's also a cultural issue, because when I had an issue, initially I spoke to my employer and said, well, could I come into the office early and leave early? And when I left, and they agreed, and when I left, the people in the office would take the mickey out of me for working hard. So it was that cultural banter that ultimately tipped over the balance, rather than the company's approach. So it's having the business culturally flexible is ultimately where you want to be. And I think all the companies across the industry are on a journey there, to be frank.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. So certainly messages to people listening, this is not necessarily about what the company offers, but it's about how we all behave as well when there are people that work with us that work flexibly. So it can be an interesting dynamic, I guess, in the workplace. Lisa, you also mentioned about taking time out to think about opportunities. Was that difficult for you to do as well?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say, similar to Steve, or I took time out on purpose. I think in some ways my time out was kind of forced on me, in the sense I was failing exams. I just couldn't figure it out. It felt like I kind of had no choice. And so I did an MBA too, which was, I wasn't necessarily thinking when I took the MBA that was like time out. It was more that was just going to help me think about other opportunities and give me the skills that I needed to explore other opportunities. And then the other time I took was whilst I was on adoption leave. I didn't necessarily have a choice. That was something it was a requirement. I absolutely needed to do that, which was quite difficult in itself when you're at a certain point in your career and you think you've got this certain, as Steve said, on paper, if it feels like it's all, yes, this is what you're supposed to do. But in your mind, in my mind, it felt like perhaps I'm hurting my career by actually taking that time out because I'm at a certain point in my career. So that in itself that's a whole different conversation, I think.
Of course,
but that was but it had a lot to do with my mindset and how I saw my career and how I saw the culture of work. But definitely, I think it was difficult to take that time out, but it was definitely exactly what I needed because, here I am today.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our briefing call, just thinking that word mindset that you used there, we talked a little bit about imposter syndrome. How's that affected you at times? How have you managed that?
Oh, well, yeah, I can definitely.
Whole other podcast, of course, isn't it?
Yeah. Interestingly, I had this statement not that long ago that really resonated with me, actually. And it was that anyone that's ever done anything for the first time, when you first start, you're going to be inexperienced and incapable. So expect and welcome that feeling of being an imposter. So if you're someone that wants to spend your entire life growing and learning, which are all things that are conducive with fulfillment, you should always feel like you're an imposter. If you're not, then one could argue that maybe you're playing it too safe. Maybe you're not challenging yourself enough. So what people call imposter syndrome isn't evidence that you were in the wrong situation, but probably clear proof that you're in the right one. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. So I'm supposed to spend my entire life doing things that somehow sometimes makes me feel like an imposter. I think having a good support network is key. And I do quite a lot of self-affirmations. I have little post-it notes, etc., just to remind myself of what I'm capable of and what I've accomplished as well. I think those are things that I've got, the little tools with under my belt that have kind of helped me. Because, every time you go into something new, you do something new, you're still going to have, well, I certainly do experience imposter syndrome anyway. So, yeah.
Steve, what about you in terms of support and sponsors and role models? How important is that for you?
I think kind of role models is easy. I'm a white man, so the industry is full of role models. I don't struggle with that. Sponsors is an interesting one because it's really important to have sponsors, but they're not always the obvious people around you. And I think you need to go out and cultivate those relationships yourself, whether they even know you them as your sponsor or not. I think along my career, I've had people that have been recruitment consultants. I've had people in other businesses completely unconnected. Yeah. And I've had senior managers that have been my kind of sponsors, but I don't think they've ever known it. I'd be very embarrassed if I started listing their names now. But they are really important because they help you fill the gaps in the way that you think and the way that you see the world. Yeah. And Lisa, I'm sure you're agreeing there, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, completely agree with everything Steve has said. It's exactly the same for me, where it's not so obvious like, oh, wait, hang on, this person is my sponsor, and here you go. It's kind of developed from relationships, and as Steve said, filling in the gaps. And if someone's aware of the skills that you have, the career, your ambitions, etc., as a relationship, and then they're aware that there's someone that's looking for that, before you know it, there's that conversation where you're being recommended. So that's kind of how these things happen. Sometimes it happens organically like that, and sometimes perhaps someone says, yeah, you're my sponsor. But for me, it's always kind of happened organically. So, I mean, there are different ways of skinning a cat, right? So,
absolutely. Look, I'm always conscious of time. I don't know, this half hour always just seems to race past. It's the quickest half hour in the whole month for me. And I really enjoy it. But so with a couple of minutes to go, I'm just going to ask you if you could leave the people listening to the podcast, what would be your kind of one piece of advice to people listening today? Lisa, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I would say, just be courageous. Just don't let fear stop you from taking a step forward. Do what you need to do, even if you do it afraid. Because being courageous is not the absence of fear, but instead it is a judgment that something else is more important than fear. So I think we need to just keep stepping forward.
Excellent. Thank you. And Steve, over to you. What's your piece of advice?
I think it's great to be ambitious, and it's great to have a plan. But life happens, and don't beat yourself up about kind of life happening. That's what makes us the rounded people we are. So, get thrown off course. Let something happen in your life and roll with it, and don't beat yourself up about it.
That's just great advice, isn't it, from both of you? And I love that piece around life happens, because I'm sure we've all felt like that, particularly over the last sort of nearly 2 years now, as things change in our lives on a regular basis. So all I can say is thank you so much for joining me today. I've just really enjoyed speaking to you and understanding career paths and directions that they can take, and what influences them and what doesn't influence them in some respects. Hopefully that's been really helpful to people listening in today, and I'm sure any of us are happy to have conversations with you should you need any unofficial sponsors. But I think at the end of the day, what we've realised is that planned or unplanned, that's actually okay. And we can survive it, and we can get through it. So thanks again to everybody for listening. Thanks to my guests today. I hope you all have a great break over Christmas, and we shall speak sometime in the new year. Thank you.